Please welcome Ben Hills.
My word, Harold Evans is a hard act to follow. I first met Graham Perkin in the autumn of 1967. He was sitting behind that great wooden desk of his in his office in the old Age building in Collins Street, which was, for those of you who remember it, a real Dickensian rabbit warren. The printers used to amuse themselves by taking pot shots at the rats that ran along the rafters in the press room with slugs of type metal. Now, Perkin was a pretty forbidding figure. He had this great barrel chest, which was straining the buttons on his white short-sleeved shirt, if you get the picture. His big chin, his big square jaw was jutting out, his eyes were bulging, and the inevitable cigarette was smoking in this huge ashtray the size of a hubcap. I mean, even though he was sitting down, he was a really dominating presence. And when he spoke, it was in this booming baritone. "Why do you want to work for the Age, chap?" Oh, because John Tidy tells me it's the best paper in Australia, Mr. Perkin. I stumbled out. Anyway, Tidy, by the way, for those of you who don't know him, was one of the hot young talents that Perkin had gathered around himself, as he said about the monumental job of revitalising the paper. I'd come to Tidy's attention a few weeks earlier when he'd been sent down to Tasmania, where I was working to cover the aftermath of the terrible Black Tuesday bushfires. Now, Tidy apparently had been impressed with my reporting of the disaster in the Hobart Mercury, and he urged me to fly over to do an interview with Perkin. Actually, I was being a bit economical with the truth. What I really had in mind when I flew over was to use the Age as a stepping stone to what I regarded as the real holy grail of Australian journalism, the Melbourne Herald. Now, it's not as silly as it seems. In the 1960s, for those of you old enough to remember, the Herald was far and away the biggest selling and most successful paper in the country. It was a rip-snorting afternoon broadsheet, and it had a circulation of over 500,000, and that was more than double the Age's. And Flinders Street had the star reporters that I most admired. John Hamilton, John Sorrell, the legendary Tom Pryor up at police rounds, and that was where I wanted to be. As for the Age, well, I didn't get to see it that much down in Tasmania, but the impression I had was that it was a boring, out-of-date, provincial Tory rag with a falling circulation, a doddering board, and not much of a future. And indeed, that would have been an accurate description up until the year before, when a dynamic new managing director, a young Ranald MacDonald, I mean, he was still only in his 20s, had sacked the editor, installed Perkin, and given him the brief, the backing, and the money to resuscitate the paper. Actually, resuscitate's not the word. The task he'd been given was more akin to carrying out a simultaneous heart, lung, and liver transplant. Perkin flipped through my pathetic collection of clippings from my stints at the Hobart Mercury, the Sydney Sun, and the Brisbane Telegraph, all national newspapers of record, of course, and said something like, "Well, don't ring us, chap." And I walked out of his office and made my way back to Hobart with my tail between my legs. It was a couple of years before I plucked up the courage to approach him again, and this time he said yes, much to my surprise. So I packed up the family onto the good ship Spirit of Tasmania and headed off to Melbourne. Now, it wasn't until some time later, when my union dues fell due, that I discovered that Perkin had also been a bit economical with the truth. He'd promised me an A grade, but I was on the books as a humble B with a margin. But by then I didn't care. I would have paid just to be in that newsroom. The Age had moved to brand new premises down at what Barry Humphries used to call the port side end of Lonsdale Street. I'd been around a bit, but I'd never seen a newsroom with anything better than bare boards or lino on the floor, let alone an editor who would challenge all comers to a midnight game of carpet bowls between editions. And the paper itself, well, you should have seen the transformation. It was quite a revelation. A bold new layout, new sections, coverage of areas like the environment, Aboriginal affairs. An investigative reporting team was on the way. Gun foreign correspondents were heading off to places like Vietnam. Once again, the editorials thundered rather than whimpered. And there was a new purpose and direction, and it was all delivered by the prodigious skills and talent, and above all, the leadership of that man. He'd become a magnet for the best and brightest journalistic talent in the country. People like Peter Smark, Creighton Burns, Cameron Forbes, who's here tonight, Michelle Grattan, Les Carline, John Spooner, Michael Gordon, Eric Beecher, whom you've seen, Mike Smith, Mark Baker, Neil Mitchell, Michael Willisey, Jennifer Byrne, Robert Drew, Roland Perry, Ron Tamberg. I mean, it's an honour roll of the great names of Australian journalism, and I haven't mentioned the half of them. So apologies to those I've left out. Out of that cradle of Perkin's newsroom have come no fewer than 21 Walkley Award winners and 7 Australian Journalists of the Year. And that's an award which is, appropriately enough, named after Graham Perkin. 8 of his protégés have been inspired to become editors, either of The Age or of other metropolitan newspapers. And it's no exaggeration to say that no other Australian editor of the 20th century has left as great a legacy. Even the politics of the paper were changing. In the run-up to the watershed election of 1972, The Age advocated a vote for Labor, almost the only occasion any mainstream paper in the country had done so since the ALP was formed more than a century ago. "Imagine me advocating a vote for the socialists," he said, and he was only half joking. Henry Bolte, the Premier of the day, in between hanging people, took to calling the paper "that dreadful pinko rag," a description we wore with pride. Perkin saved the paper by tapping into the mood of the new Melbourne, and the circulation, revenues and reputation of The Age were soaring. Tidy was only halfway right. The paper I was joining was not just the best in Australia. Within a couple of years, it will be ranked as one of the 10 greatest newspapers in the world, up there with the Times of London, the New York Times and the Washington Post. So where did this extraordinary man come from and what drove him? Other speakers tonight who knew Perkin much better than I, who'd seen him in action as one of the finest reporters this country has seen, who worked alongside him as he rebuilt the paper, can talk about his earlier career. I was commissioned a few years ago to write his biography, and I was more interested in his earlier life, which was quite a mystery to all but his very closest friends and his family. I discovered that, in spite of his air of urbane sophistication, Perkin had his roots in the country. He did his growing up ferreting for rabbits and bowling with massive exertion and minimal accuracy for the local cricket team. Although he was born in Hopetoun, if I can just correct something, he was born in the maternity hospital in Hopetoun, but he actually grew up in a little Western Districts town called Warracknabeal. For those of you who've been there, its only sort of features of any distinction are the fact that at either end of the main street, one end there's a sculpture of some bales of wheat, and the other end there's a kelpie rounding up some sheep. Not very promising roots for a man who'd be one of the great journalist this country's seen. So where did it all come from? His colossal capacity for sheer hard work. Unlike most editors today, he was nearly always there to see the first edition roll off the press. That seems to have come from his father, Bert, who was a baker, a trade that also involved burning the midnight oil 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. His passion for social justice, and who can forget his enthusiasm during what we called the Minus Children campaign, when he was gallivanting around town in a double-decker bus collecting money for the intellectually disabled. Where did that come from? I've no doubt that was inspired by his mother, Iris, a devout Methodist. The one value she didn't pass on to her firstborn son was her belief in the Temperance League, of which she was a badge-wearing member. More than 30 years later, Perkin, who was then married with children of his own, if he heard his parents' footsteps on the driveway, he'd rush to hide his bottle of scotch before he got a tongue lashing. And as for his frugality, well, he was born a few days before Christmas in 1929, and his entire childhood was spent in the shadow of the Great Depression and the ominous years leading up to the Second World War. The Perkins weren't exactly impoverished, like the swagmen who used to knock at their door offering to chop wood for food, but just think of this, even though the house was full every day of the smell of freshly baked bread, the Perkins were still only allowed to eat the stale leftover loaves 2 or 3 days later. Now, I've often wondered where he got the drive to become a journalist, and some of the people I talked to who knew him then believe he was always going to be a wordsmith. He excelled in English. He was a champion debater. When he was at school, his satchel was always full of books he borrowed from the Mechanics Institute, and his first ever job was covering the cricket for the local rag. He was good but a little verbose, said one of his school friends. But it seems that in spite of these obvious talents, his parents had more ambitious plans for Perkin than becoming a mere hack. With his fine baritone voice, he once won a prestigious prize at the Ballarat Eisteddfod. His mother took him to Melbourne to audition as a professional singer, of all things. Fortunately, nothing came of this. His dad, on the other hand, saw him as a professional and had him enrolled at the Melbourne University in a law course. Perkin kept pretty quiet about this, but when I got hold of his academic record from the university, I found out that he'd dropped out after failing to keep up with his Latin, a subject which was then required for a career in the law. So the law's loss was journalism's gain. Now, with hindsight, he was clearly cut out for the job. He worked his way up through the ranks, and after 9 glorious years at the helm of the paper, he was dead of a heart attack at the age of 45. But the story didn't end there. The day we got the news of his death, a friend of mine sent me a note in which he paraphrased John O'Hara's words on hearing of the death of George Gershwin, who died at an equally tragic young age. Graham Perkin died today, he wrote. We don't have to believe that if we don't want to. It's a tribute to his life that we're all here tonight, and that the age, Australian journalism, and public life in general is so much the richer for it. Thank you.